Thank you, Toro. Apologies. I have one from Debbie Hewitt, who's unable to attend. Do we have any other apologies? Joinella is an apology. Corona? And Matua is an apology.
And Debbie Hewitt.
Yeah, I got her. Do we have a quorum?
We don't need a quorum, it's a workshop.
It's a workshop, we don't need a quorum. Kane?
Mr. Chair, Joinella had run this one protocol that had not good recovery for it, and hence Liz is here. So just to let you know, in case you have a spare, so Liz
Come to the table.
Yeah, yeah.
Workshop, no problem.
It's a workshop. Liz, up you come, mate, come on. Okay, so we've noted the apologies. Can I ask someone to move to...
Yes, I have to leave at 2 o'clock.
Neil, he won't come.
Toro is definitely an apology. He's leaving in 55 minutes.
My wife's going away for 3
If he
weeks.
doesn't,
Okay, well then you're forgiven. You are forgiven. Okay, can we have someone to move to accept the apologies?
I'll move.
Mover, and Peter Bevan will second. All those in favour? Aye. Thank you very much. Any notices? No notices?
Yes, Mr.
Oh, you
Chair,
do
if I
have a
may.
notice?
I
Gee.
do, so it's...
Trouble with you down there. I can't see you.
I know. I missed this at our RPC, and I realise it's a workshop, but I would like to take the opportunity to formally acknowledge Hawke's Bay Regional Council with regards to Heitia Hiha's tangi. On behalf of the marae and the whānau, a request was sent out to the chair and the chief executive to be proactive to look for areas where they might be able to support that funeral. And I just want to acknowledge the Hawke's Bay Regional Council coming forward in that space willingly, and the kaumātuas were much appreciative of the buses that were provided to enable them to attend the funeral and to make it to the urepa. So on behalf of the whānau and those who were there those who were there in respect of the passing of Mātua Hiha, I'd just like to acknowledge the support of Hawke's Bay Regional Council. Ngā mihi nui ki a koutou katoa. Kia ora.
Thank you, Api. It was certainly passing one of our legends that day, no doubt about that. Okay, if we have no more notices, we'll go straight into the substance of our meeting, and we'll pass the floor first to Tom, is it? Oh, and welcome, Tanya.
Kia ora.
Can I just check, Tanya, would you like to see the presenters and the screen or the wider meeting room today?
It's probably better to see you guys. I've got the presentation in front of me.
Okay.
So I can, so long as the speakers just tell me what slide they're on as they're going, that would be helpful.
So we'll do our best, Tanya.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you. Look, I just want to briefly open this workshop with just a confirmation that following the last RPC meeting, we had some discussions around what would be the best use of time in this workshop, and it seemed to me that it was apparent from some of the feedback we got that even though we had just covered some of the issues of non-consensus at the last meeting, that there was a desire, particularly from tangata whenua reps, to dive deeper and better understand, particularly around issues of flow enhancement and some of the more detail around that. So we have framed this this particular workshop up in focusing on those areas. But we're also conscious that this being the tank plan change, the size and scale of it, and we've seen through email traffic and since our last meeting that there are obviously a number of broader issues and requests for further information that we know that some members in particular are very keen for us to address. So look, in that respect, it is one of the reasons why we've suggested that we don't proceed with the workshop next week, because I want to make sure that we as a team have got a really clear understanding of the information requirements and what are the particular issues that are driving that. So I want to make sure, from our perspective, that we capture it, we make sure that we've articulated back so it's understood and that we can go away and do the work. And I felt that we were at risk of slipping into another, and effectively these two workshops were placeholed a while back, and I just didn't want to fall into another workshop without making sure that we're meeting your information requirements. So please feel free, and we've got a whiteboard up there, and so to Tanya, we may leave script a little bit, which is not going to help you following your slides in front of you, but please, if you do have particular questions or concerns, or even if you want to lead with those questions and concerns before we start, we'd rather give you the information that you want and looking for rather than the information that we think you want and looking for. So we're happy to proceed into our presentation and slides, but we're happy to hear from committee members at the outset if they think that would be useful in terms of the work that we bring forward.
I have two questions.
Yes.
Mr. Chair. Tom, I'll just mention these now, but they may be addressed in your presentation, so I don't expect to discuss them now, but I just thought I'd flag them. One was a question around augmentation and the impact on springs.
Yes.
And the other one was around the definition of the freshwater management units and the involvement that Tank had in helping to define those.
Excellent. So I imagine we're going to have a good discussion around augmentation, and if we get a chance to get onto the FMU piece, we will. Look, so they're up on the whiteboard, Tanya, and so we've captured those.
Cool, thank you.
So Tom, you finished, have you?
Yep, so I'm finished. So if there are no further questions, and not that that's the end of questions, obviously, I'm happy to hand over to Marianne and Jeff to see.
Oh, Tom, you have a question? Yes. Man, then
Okay.
the floor is yours.
So what we've prepared some material for you on are another brief look at the tank overview, just to give you a better idea about the context of the decision making. And we want to, as Tom said, make sure that we understand what your questions and issues are. We have presentation material on the science and modelling results, particularly in relation to oxygen and flow requirements in the lowland streams, and the stream flow enhancement solution that Jeff has some material on. So looking at the options that were considered and modelled, the current state and the importance of oxygen, which is actually covered in the first one, and how the scheme is intended to work. We've also got material on the Narara River solution, the enhancement solution there, and some further material on high flow allocation. There were some concerns around the existing storage pattern and provisions for new water that we can review for you. Just to remind you, there are some other or further reporting still to come. We are preparing a discussion document around or providing an overview of the nutrient management provisions that are in the plan draft. I actually have some maps showing the draft FMUs, so we can come to that later this afternoon if we have time. And that paper will look to getting decisions in relation to management of land use change. We have some information on the drinking water and protection of drinking water for community supply, and the decision is in relation to recommendations from the joint working group. We are also just completing the provisions around stormwater management, taking into account the feedback from the workshop of the 14th, and also completing some of the rural risk assessment requirements there. So we'll have some further reporting on that. And the preparation of version 8. So there are a number of minor details within version 8 that we will need to report on as well, pick up some of the loose ends, as it were. And the final process steps, there are still other bits of work in train around the Section 32 report that's being compiled. the implementation plan. So that was, as you recall, still in draft, but is very much an important document in supporting the plan change. Information around decisions for consultation notification is still to come to you, and decisions around the hearing process. So those are to come. So in the meantime, we just wanted to give you the opportunity to let us know where you still have concerns or issues, or where you need further clarification that we can also feed into those further reporting steps for you. We are poised at the whiteboard if there's anything else. Not so much.
Probably also, and I mentioned it in an email that went out last night, that we'd obviously be very keen to sit with the technical advisors at the earliest opportunity and really go over the plan and figure out, which review the information that's been sent out, the adequacy of it, the issues, and so hopefully in the next wee while, or probably a better use of our time for this next Wednesday slot was to have that session when and if the technical advisors are available, and so if messages aren't necessarily fed back through today, they can be fed back through the TAs.
Just a question: are we able to get in the augmentation anyway? There are stakeholders that have resource consents that are going to be rolled over, and I'm wondering, I wouldn't mind having a look at that, because it's around the, yeah.
So which, in terms of people who have groundwater consents, so they, depending on the timing of the plan, I mean, one of the reasons behind the plan is to have the rules to guide the reissue of those consents.
Yep. Yes. But I understand some are going to be rolled over.
If we don't have any policy to guide a change.
Sorry, Tom, I think she may be talking about, Jenny may be talking about grandfathering provisions in there.
That would be it. It's a union term, I recognise.
There aren't exactly grandfathering provisions, in that any consent holder still needs to go through a consent application process, but there is a recognition of existing investment, and that's actually been narrowly focused and defined now in relation to actual and reasonable use. So it's not so much grandfathering as a method of reallocation that recognises existing investment and use.
It's the existing investment that I'm interested in.
Jenny, you started off talking about augmentation, so you're talking about...
I'm particularly focused on the augmentation.
So the only consent will be the Twyford Irrigators Collective consent for their existing augmentation scheme. So is that what you're interested in, or you're interested in the groundwater consents, of which there's over 2,000 expiring next year, that will need to be rolled over because of the delays in notifying this plan change?
Anything that hits the aquifers, which I'm interested in those, that will be continually considered. I don't know, I suppose. I just want to know what the impacts of the current provisions that will carry on, whether it's an investment, whether it's grandparented. I just want to know what those are.
So all of the existing consents are operating under the current Regional Resource Management Plan. When they are rolled over, between now and such time as this plan that you are now working on becomes operative, they will roll over on the current basis. So effectively they will be rolled over on their current terms, but they will be rolled over on a short term, which is the practice we've been in now for 5-6 years, trying to get them all coming up for review
At the same time,
so that when this policy becomes effective that you are determining, that then has the impact on those consents in terms of how they will be issued in the future. So
no?
Well, until you change the policy, and that's part of the issue here, is that the sooner this plan goes operative, the sooner we actually start to more actively manage a resource that has been open slather.
So investment, you're talking about, which is different to the policies.
Yes.
So
So I'm just trying to ascertain what are the issues to consider or factor in for sustainability and long-term of the tank plan change. So I remember listening to the people that put in a lot of investment and infrastructure, and therefore it appeared to me that they would be continuing in some form or other.
Oh, Jenny, I'm actually talking on those today,
Okay.
so that might help. If not, we can revisit it.
In relation to augmentation? No? Right across the plain?
We were talking about the high flow allocation, actually.
I don't think that's what Jenny's driving at here.
Oh, okay.
I've got the feeling you could be reading that wrong, James. We had at the RPC meeting last week, I had a number of questions regarding a particular policy about existing takes being maintained regardless of what the plan change was.
Yeah, those surface takes in the upper catchment that we were talking about?
Yeah, but in general, I mean, that you had an extract of one particular policy in the whole plan change.
Yep.
I'd be keen to know what other policies are in there that, contentious or otherwise,
Yes.
that have those same sort of provisions.
Yes. So I think we're talking about a number of different things across. So Marianne was referring to the standing provisions in the Resource Management Act that require you to take into account existing use and existing investment when reviewing a consent.
Yes.
You've also got the policy in the plan, which has to be informed by the Section 32 analysis. So in deciding the policies that you're taking forward in this plan change, you also have to consider the impact on existing investment, etc. So there's a number of different tiers to this. The specific information Jenny's requesting is what I'm just trying to understand so that we can once again meet the request.
I'm trying to identify in layman's terms what I need to factor in that has impacts on sustainability. So it's a lot of what Paul has said. It's a bit of what Marianne has said, and you said you would address some of those issues, and also what you said. It's just about sustainability. What are the factors that are going to come in and impact on the plan change that we need to consider whilst considering the plan change?
Just want a list.
Yeah, just a list would be
A
good.
list of all the resource consents might do it.
Well, that'll be a good
In relation to
start.
water.
It's about 3,000.
I'm not entirely sure whether the list of all resource consents. I mean, if you've got a resource consent that's going to be expiring, and I understand you're going to roll some over and so on a short term, and then they get reviewed. The ones specifically I'm concerned about are the ones where, even though when they expire, they're just going to be rolled over on current conditions without having to give effect to or they're not having to take into account the rules that are going to apply for everyone else. Because that's what I was told last week, that this particular clause was in there for that reason. So I don't know how many of the...
That's a very specific issue. The question I'm hearing from Jenny is a fundamental question about the sustainability of the resource and all of the factors that are going to influence the sustainability.
No, it was never that big. I was actually carrying on from the conversation that we had that Paul was referring to. So it made me think, what are the things that are going to impact, that are going to be rolled over?
Right.
The other factors, I mean, you still got to take that into account because it all impacts on sustainability. So I'm sure they and Paul's reference is what I'm after, because we were talking about that both at the last meeting.
So the high flow allocation stuff will be dealt with by Jeff.
But it's not only high. Is it only high? Is that the only time it appears?
Yes,
Or-
in relation to that particular
No,
provision.
in relation to the whole plan change. How many others are through the plan change? Because I'm no legal expert and can understand the consequences of wording.
Okay.
That's what I expect to know. Now, whether or not, obviously, once we know that, we've still got to take account of Section 32 and current economic investment and all that nonsense. But until I actually know how many are involved and scattered throughout the whole draft plan change, I'm at a loss to know just what the consequences are of that.
Said perfectly, thank you.
So I think it's the only example I can think of in there.
It is the only example. And maybe referring to the fact that the plan change doesn't pretend to be based on all the necessary information. It actually acknowledges there are a number of information gaps And policy 37 is particularly important, and I'm thinking this might address some of your concerns, Councillor, in that it's saying that we've reached a point at which we need to set limits. We know there are issues and limits are being set. Things are not going to get worse, but we don't know everything in relation to the pattern of land use, the mitigation measures that are going to be adopted, and there is a commitment that we revisit these decisions in the 10-year time frame for plan reviews.
Chairman, can I just raise an issue of process? I think we're all getting overwhelmed with paper on this exercise. This, what was sent out to us, is there anything new in there, or is that just a regurgitation of?
It's the same paper.
What was sent was the copy of the presentation that you received at the last workshop. So if there are items that you raise, we can perhaps refer to some of those slides that you've already seen. But you've got no new information apart from what we've got on the slides. So that's delving more deeply into some of the issues that you've raised.
Sorry, you just referred to a particular clause in the current clause of Rule 37?
It's Policy 37.
Policy 37.
So if you've got your copy of version 7 in front of you from two meetings ago.
Just trying to check it down.
Page 31 of the document.
Got a page number?
30.
That must have been the 14th, was it? That was the 14th of August, wasn't it?
Yes, yep.
So,
Yes.
that's... Right, I'll find it.
What's that noise? What's it tell you, Tom?
Pages
Policy 37.
Okay.
Let's describe that as an insurance policy.
Yes, essentially.
And it couldn't be more comforting, I would have thought, to policymakers to have that in there.
Creates a question for me, but
Okay, so
we'll carry on.
that's cool.
Anyone new to the game, what does it impact on them? These guys are already embedded in the game. Investors, any settlement groups that have plans?
Oh, that's the question.
I suppose my query on policy 37 is what is the impact of the current players that are in the game versus new players that get introduced and want to participate within it? So that's just one of my queries. It's all right if you're already in the game, you're looked after and you can get reviewed over 10 years, but if you're new, I don't know, like new investors, there's been a lot of settlement investors. There's no, I just wondered what the impact would be on any new investors.
So, a new applicant...
That looks after current.
A new applicant for water. That's what you mean by investor? An applicant for new water?
Yeah, they might want to enter the game.
Well, under the provisions, we've established that we've reached a limit and there will be no more new allocation of water.
So this looks after all the current users?
Yes, yep. There was a discussion paper prepared for Tank that we could circulate as well in relation to how else could you reallocate water that we could circulate to the committee as well. So what other criteria or regimes could the council adopt? So we did look through a whole range of other options for reallocation of water.
So the plan change looks, yeah. It's not a free market system, it's looking after what's currently in the market.
I'd like to comment on that because that is actually one of the challenges of what we've done. And I've had 2 phone calls from people that own land who would like to develop the land, can't get water. from my perspective, that this is a moment in time, and as we get better in using water and we get better in understanding the science, hopefully we'll resolve that, because, you know, you're dead right. We make existing holders of water wealthy and their land worth twice as much. And it's not really that great, the unintended consequences of some of this. So, yeah, we'll need to work that out as we go forward. One of the things that I'd like to just mention to Jenny, though, just in a simplistic, because like her, I like it in a simplistic way. They found in the big drought in, I think, 2013 or 11, whichever it was, time flies, the growers used 47% of their allocated water. So we actually had a culture prior, and we introduced the global consent. But prior to that, people just walk in to because we thought in Hiratonga we had unlimited water, of course, and everyone used to go in and just say, and I remember myself saying, I need X water, and the guy would say, oh, you might as well take Y, because there's plenty there and you never know what you're going to do in the future. So even in the biggest drought, we only used 47% of the allocation. So when they come up under this plan, we'll be saying to growers, well, there's your maximum use, that's all you need in the consent going forward. That doesn't actually, it's only a documenting thing, of course, but it's quite significant. The other thing that I thought was significant in the global consents was, prior to having that and talking to everybody, when the growers thought they were going to go on ban, they used to irrigate flat out and saturate their soils, so they'd use twice as much water as they needed. When you had a considered approach to use of water, they didn't do that. So there's a whole lot of practical things that come out of plans like this, but it won't be perfect. And that is unintended consequences we have to work our head around somehow as we go forward, because we do want to have continual development on the Hiratonga Plains.
Chairman, another issue of process. What is the capacity or ability for members of this committee who have particular concerns or want to clarify something in their own minds to be able to contact people offline and sort those things out? Because I think we're going to get bogged down if we expect every query or lack of understanding or misunderstanding to be settled in a large group like this.
So look, we're very happy to take them offline, and very helpful. The more the merrier. Just ask for them to be channeled through Tom. The issue we've just discussed, I think we discussed at the last workshop or the previous one, where I explained that there was a 20% allocation for tangata whenua built into the water storage provisions as a way of addressing this historic issue, which is a nationwide problem, first in, first served, and what it means for particularly newly settled treaty groups and for Māori land that hasn't previously had access to water. So we did have a discussion about it previously. That is the provision. Whether that provision is sufficient enough is certainly over to you to determine, but that's what was recommended by the Tank Group.
Well, the provision, whilst it's good that it's there, it's actually, it has due process for treaty settlement, is to try to reacquire what you've settled for, you know, what you've lost. So 20% of what we've lost in regards to land use and land management isn't there. So post-settlement for us is a whole host of opportunities to reinvest. But because we're a late entry to the game, we're only limited. We're limited and there's no equity in that. So that's what I'm flagging.
No, well, it's actually not true. Because
yes, it is, Rex.
It's not true. It's not true. Because you think of the Hiratonga Plains, can you tell me 100-acre paddock that's bare land, not got water on it, that tangata whenua that's come back in treaty? I'd defy you to have one. If treaty claimants want to invest, they're more than likely going to invest in existing structures. They won't be going off and buying a bare land without any water.
I agree with that. But it's still not, that's not the issue. It's about an equitable playing ground and opportunity to re-enter equitably. So what I'm doing is just flagging
With the
that.
same opportunity as everybody else.
Treaty settlement was created because there wasn't the same opportunity.
No, but it's created to create the same opportunity.
But hang
I'm
on,
flagging it, that's all. I'm just flagging
Can we
it.
just
Well,
go
it's
back?
flagged, it's erroneous.
Can we just go back to the
not erroneous.
question here? Is there any land that's been turned back over to the claimant groups that can be irrigated from the aquifer?
Or isn't.
Is there any land?
Or isn't currently.
The detail of that is not the issue
I thought it
I'm
was hugely important.
flagging. The detail is that the current people have the opportunity and new entry, in particular for treaty investment post-settlement, obviously are penalised for that, and I just want that flagged.
Not particular though. Neil, and then, all right.
I don't want to labour on it.
It may be helpful.
You're the one labouring.
No, hang on. It may be helpful.
Being
Mr.
facetious.
It may be helpful, Mr. Chair, if we have a profile of the consents that are going to expire over the next 10 years. Is that information available? So we've got, we don't need to table all 8,000 consents, but do we know what the expiry dates by year are? So that's a piece of information that I think I heard both Jenny and Paul requesting, and it sounds like a piece of information readily obtainable. Is it?
Yes.
Yeah, we do know which.
And was that tabled as a part of the current tank, the tank considerations over the past 6 years? Was it part of that documentation?
Yes.
So it's readily obtainable. We can get it, and for this exercise, it occurs to me that the proposition that Jenny's put on the table is essentially to say the opportunity, if you like, sits with the reconsenting of those allocations and the potential to claw back, if that's the term we use, as a result of that process. And then what do we do with that, and whether there's any capacity for tangata whenua to then access that capacity. It's a secondary consideration, but in the first instance we're looking for knowledge of what that potential is.
Actually, Neil, I know the scientists want answers, but it doesn't help because the actual use is still overuse.
That's fine, but you can draw some conclusions subsequent to determine what the current consenting regime does, and whether it's we're saying we're 47% use of the allocation,
50 say,
or
yeah.
50%, is the current capacity at 50%. If it's greater than 50%, then becomes a discussion as to the equitable allocation of that resource should, for example, tangata whenua seek to obtain it.
My point is, and you're not listening, is it's not real. You know, if you allocate it, you will be over-allocating. The 50% is the limit, is that correct?
What the plan provides for is an interim allocation limit until we better understand the actual pattern of water use through water meter data, and test that against what's happening in the streams and also in relation to the stream flow enhancement program. So,
but it is effectively a 50% reduction or thereabouts. That's right.
Nevertheless, a piece of information has been asked for, which seems to be relatively easy to obtain, and we can just provide it.
Yep, and this is an issue that obviously the tank group considered, and perhaps Councillor Belford might want to speak to it, but the tank group did consider it. I probably need to take some guidance from the left here, but the extent to which this plan change can seek to affect treaty redress or effectively claw back an allocation from one constituency to make it available to another.
Sure. Well, it's not our brief to do that, but nevertheless, a piece of information has been asked for, which is available and seems to me to be relatively easy to be passed, to be resurrected and provided, and we can draw any conclusion we like about that, whether it's valid or not.
Well, it's not particularly helpful to duck the issue implicit in all of this, which is that if 100% of the water actually being used represents what we are now told by our science team to be the maximum we should be using to not mine the aquifer, then the reality is that there's not 20% of headroom for anybody, right? There's no headroom. We're using all the water, as best we can tell today, we're using all the water we should be using prudently to do what we're doing today without further mining the aquifer and making or entering an unsustainable situation vis-a-vis the aquifer. So from that standpoint, the folks who have consents are first in line, as it were. They are the user group that has under the current regime, those are the folks who have their hands on the water. And unless we find new water or conserve water we're presently using and create the headroom that way, or roll back use of actual water, there ain't any more to be distributed.
Mr. Chairman. And so the 20% did relate to that high flow water.
Yeah.
If you were to want to sell or purchase your existing land with the takes, it would be a factor, wouldn't it? Or access to water. A current user with a resource consent was selling their land along with a resource consent to a investor or a new investor or a new business user. That would be a factor, wouldn't it? The rollover of the I suppose the durability and sustainability of the water allocation and purchase of that land. So that would be a factor too.
Like Australia. Okay.
So I'm thinking about both ends of the scale. So
I like the thinking of Councillor Belford in terms of the fact that only so much water.
Yep, exactly.
Really, challenge that confronts us is how we use less.
Exactly.
Challenge, because the council and the RMA is meant to have regard to kaitiakitanga, okay? So kaitiakitanga to us is not just about what humans need, but it's also about what fauna and flora in the water need. So we have a diagram here about reference to Te Mana o Te Wai, and I think we need to be thinking about this whole issue in a different way, about the first respect being given to the water, and the things that live in it, and the things that benefit from it. Now, in terms of this justification about first rights or whatever it is, I think Māori, we're here first, and the treaty guaranteed us for the exclusive possession of all our tonga, including our water. So offering us 20% is, to me, a bit of an insult. I would prefer we got offered 50% and then we would surrender 30% of it, so that the fish and all the other things that are reliant on it can be still part of this country in another 100 years. That's my soapbox, Mr. Bevan.
Thank you, Tony.
Can we keep going, Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not actually sure of the value of the next few slides. I think they might be a little bit too high level in terms of the discussion that you've been having, but it was a reminder that the plan is complex and covers a wide area and lots of issues. But some key provisions in the plan are that we prevent further degradation and improve states where necessary, and that abstraction limits and water quality limits are provided in the plan with a priority approach, particularly in relation to water quality. But also, I think a key feature of the plan is the recognition of community responsibility. And you've seen this map before to illustrate the range of issues and complexity that we're looking at. In terms of quantity, the process that was followed was understanding the values that the water had to be managed for and deciding what kind of attributes provide information around the state of those values. And the attributes are what we can measure and what we can collect information about to tell us about the state of those values. And we set objectives for each of those attributes. So in relation to water quantity, the key attributes are simply river flows, groundwater levels and security of supply. And we set limits for those in relation to the allocation limits, the minimum flows, the security of supply standards are understood, and groundwater levels are also provided for. And you've seen this slide before as well, and the slides that Jeff has prepared are in relation to the, what slide number are we up to? Is it 9? It's slide, slide number 9, that we're focusing on stream flow augmentation and how that has been modelled and how it can work to mitigate the adverse effects of the stream depletion from groundwater takes. And Jeff has a number of slides to illustrate that in more detail. In terms of quality, the same sort of process, that it's understanding the values that we're managing the water for and what kind of attributes tell us about those values. And for water quality, the attributes include things like sediment, deposited sediment and clarity, nutrient levels, bacteria, algae, macrophyte growth, invertebrates. There's a whole list of attributes that are relevant to water quality, and the plan includes the management of those attributes through setting targets and limits for the state of water quality, has a whole range of rules and methods to meet the objectives that are set, and we've talked briefly about freshwater management units, and that's the spatial management of water quality. In relation to quality, we've relied on lots of models. It's a little bit different than water quantity, where you can measure it more readily, but for water quality we relied on quite complex models, a whole range of them, and we'll report further on the nutrient management in particular, touching also on sediment management in further reports. And so Jeff's got some information around the flow augmentation or the stream flow enhancement program that we've included to give you some more detail around the science. So I'm going to swap to the other presentation.
Can't see that. Just take a look.
Okay, it's entitled Tank Plan Change Lowland Stream Flow Enhancement.
Thanks, Marianne. Kia ora koutou. There are these slides are printed out. Everyone has them. Is that right?
No.
Oh, great. Okay, I'll carry on.
What page are they?
Oh, they're not. It turns out. Sorry.
Oh, I
Rex.
can't see them. It's my look at Tania.
Yeah.
That's right.
Happy to provide this presentation afterwards if needed. Much of the material in here was presented last year, in September last year, to the Regional Planning Committee, but I don't think it's going to hurt at all to run through that stuff again to put the whole picture together, hopefully. So I'll start off by talking about the current allocation and the effects on lowland streams, and then the groundwater surface water interaction and the stream depletion modelling that we've done. So please bear with me if it seems too familiar. I just want everyone to be on the same page with this stuff. And then there are modelling simulations of stream flow enhancement that were done, and I'll go through some of the questions that were asked last week, be addressing those. And then how the plan proposes to implement that flow enhancement, and again that I think will consider some of the questions that were raised last week. So on the Heretaunga Plains, these are our towns and cities. There's a whole bunch of groundwater and surface water interaction going on there, and I think one of the key things about these interactions is the timing between them. So you have water that falls as rainfall and disappears from the rivers relatively quickly out to sea, whereas groundwater can take longer. And then you have the discharges of groundwater to springs. And again, it's the timing of those discharges and what's going on in there that's really important for us to consider here. On top of that, as I think we might have shown last week as well, the three main groups that groundwater is allocated to are public water supplies, industrial use and irrigation. And that's happening throughout the Heretaunga Plains. And I know I've seen this before, but this is the plot of groundwater utilisation, so the groundwater that's actually been used since 1980. The lower green bars here, these ones here, this is your municipal water supplies, which has remained quite static since 1980. And then industrial takes up here, sort of increased until about maybe 20 years ago, and then they've remained reasonably static as well. And there's some other relatively minor takes going on in there for domestic water supplies and stock drinking water and frost protection. And then there's the irrigation takes, which is those top ones, and that has largely been driving the increase in groundwater utilisation over time. So that we now have, as we've discussed, approximately 90 million cubic metres were used in that really dry summer of 2012-13. And we use the data from that year quite often in the assessments to inform this plan change. Because it was a dry year, we quite often use it as a conservatively worst case example if we want to focus on one particular year. On average, the groundwater abstraction is around about 75 million cubic metres a year.
Just before you go off that,
Yep.
question.
And then I have one too.
Yep.
Chairman, through you, the artificial recharge,
Yes.
that was up until that artificial recharge at Roy's Hill stopped.
Yep.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's why it's on the negative side of the graph, because that was an input rather than an abstraction. So that was...
went up to about 2008 or 9.
That's correct.
Now, the reason it was stopped, or the reason we were told it should be stopped, going back historically, is it said that it was ineffective and it was not doing a job. But this actually indicates that it was doing a job.
Yep, it's true. It was to some extent doing a job, but the spatial extent of where that effect was felt was quite localised, and the modelling suggests much of the water was returning to the Narora River. So it did go into the aquifer, which is what we've modelled here, but it wasn't a widespread benefit based on the model.
Localised. I mean, the graph indicates that it's just about the quantity of industrial use in any case, but
yeah,
that wouldn't have happened.
That's right. Yeah.
So should recharge be reconsidered? Is it being reconsidered?
Yeah, we did some modelling on managed aquifer recharge in the Heretaunga Plains. So we looked at the existing site and played around with what different allocations might mean in terms of recharging the aquifer at that site. And then also chose another site more closer to Flaxmere to get it closer into the middle of the plains. And the modelling, the conclusion from the modelling was that the benefit was quite small and really localised. Yeah, it's I think because the aquifer is so transmissive, it travels very fast. In a slower moving aquifer system, the water would stay there for longer. So you're recharging pretty much through winter because it's high flow that goes in there, and by the time summer comes along, it's sort of moved on.
Out as a future option.
I wouldn't say it's entirely out, and I think the plan would still enable that to happen if we started exploring other locations. We haven't explored, for example, injection into the confined aquifer itself, which is more costly, but yeah.
Because it's high flow abstraction, isn't it?
It's going to be fast.
Yeah, that's right. The minimum flow for these abstractions went from quite low in the 1980s, up to 5,000 litres a second was the minimum flow by the time it was closed. Yeah.
So just out of interest,
Pause. I had my hand up before you, Councillor.
Take control of the meeting.
I'll do my best here. Do we know, in the growth of the irrigators, do we know by sector what the use is?
I think we could tease that apart. We haven't done that analysis as such explicitly, have we?
We could probably extract that from the economic modelling that was done.
From the pumping stats. I'd be really interested in that, and I'd also be really interested in trying to get my head around, do we have any particular efficient users of water? Is there any, of the sectors there are, within the irrigators, is there anyone who's particularly efficient, or anyone by hectare? That would be quite difficult, but over the growing season, and do we have any really poor users? So if you could just, get your head around that.
I don't have the information myself, but I know the council was working on a summer program with irrigators to measure levels of efficiency of water use across.
Well, you get it from the little thermometer things. Yeah.
You get their water use, but you also have to work out how they've used it on the ground. So how is it applied? How many leaks have they got in their system? Where is it all landing? So that work was done on a number of farms or a number of properties over the previous summer with help from Irrigation New Zealand, and there was a report that was produced on that we could circulate for you.
That was the one we had at the ENS.
Okay, Toro and then Peter.
My question follows the recharging issue. There's been some concern that we have lost 90% of our wetlands. And all those wetlands are where species live that they say are environmentally critical. So all the recharging is going to be from springs and places where they are the remnants of our wetlands. And they say frogs are an important environmental indicator. Given we are at a high level of stress, what studies have you done on frogs?
We had one come in the house the other day.
There's an overlap with this between this plan and the biodiversity strategy that the council has prepared with a whole range of stakeholders, and there are commitments both in this plan around particularly wetland, new wetland creation essentially, and some milestones for new wetland creation that complement a whole lot of the provisions in the biodiversity strategy. And there are overlaps in relation to commitments for more information around Indigenous species in both this plan through the implementation plan and the biodiversity plan as well. So much bigger focus on protecting the aquatic habitat for Indigenous species and creating new.
Just a follow on from that question. Where is, what is your dialogue in terms of Department of Conservation? Because they have obligations in terms of protection, in terms of water quality and all that kind of, and the Indigenous species area.
I think that's probably best illustrated through the implementation plan, where I'm working with the various stakeholders to identify lead agencies, and Department of Conservation is a lead agency. I can't off the top of my head tell you which bits of the implementation plan they're lead agency for, but it's to recognise the roles and responsibilities of a range of stakeholders in improving environmental performance.
It's worth noting also that the Department of Conservation had a permanent member on the TANK group through there, and in the next stage of your pre-consultation prior to notification, you will need to consult both the Minister of Conservation and the Department of Conservation, so they will have due statutory input into the process.
Peter?
Just going back to the recharge, what's the source of the water that was used for that purpose?
It was from the Narurura River.
So how could you be confident that it wasn't contaminating the aquifer?
I guess two things. Contamination, bacterial sort of microbiological
Fresh
contamination.
Water. They don't do it anymore, so...
Yeah, but it's still a possibility, Jeff said.
Yeah, it may have, but it wouldn't have lasted longer than, well, generally those bugs don't last longer than 1 or 2 years, so I don't think it's any long-term effect. If it did contaminate the aquifer, I guess people would have got sick if it was an issue. Having said that, managed aquifer recharge these days isn't undertaken like the Roy's Hill scheme was, where it was just a really good idea and Kiwi ingenuity, let's get out there and make a soakage pit and poke water in it. It's not done like that anymore. The source water has to be considered.
And do remember, Councillor, that the Ngāruaru main stem is losing 5 cubic metres a second into the bed, into the aquifer anyway. So that surface, contaminated surface water already by natural processes feeds into the aquifer continuously. This was only a couple of 100 metres to the right, if you like.
But right. People in Flaxburn Twyford are tough, mate.
My concerns regarding recharge also apply to augmentation. I have to be sorry, my apologies.
You're off.
I've got to give my wife instructions on expenditure while she's on holiday.
Why do you think she's going on holiday?
She's got a sick sister, she says.
Okay, are there any more questions? Otherwise, we'll carry on. Alan's right, we'll be here all night.
Yeah, cool. And as we know, the actual allocation on paper. Why is it going backwards? Oh, scrolling. Is around about twice what's actually used. And so, as we know, the effects of 180 million cubic metres a year being used would be, I'd say, catastrophic on the aquatic ecosystems in the Ngāruaru River. And so that's why the plan is looking to take that back to be consistent with the actual water use. So just to refresh memories here, this is a map of the stream depletion, the abstractions of groundwater throughout the plains. So the large green circles there are the municipal water supply takes, and the size of the circle is an indication of, the bigger the circle, the bigger the abstraction. So the largest takes on the plains are municipal and industrial takes. But that's not to say that they have the biggest impact, because as you saw before, most of the abstraction is from irrigation, and that's happening through hundreds and hundreds of relatively smaller takes all throughout the plains. And, yep.
How do you create a balance across those?
How do you mean a balance, Jenny?
Well, the municipal water supply is large and the industrial supply is large and irrigation is even larger. How do you create balance with the current take?
Balance and what are we balancing, sorry?
Well, that it doesn't go over. I mean, depletion. And in regards to depletion, how do you word it? How do you assure that the depletion is manageable? I know I'm using the wrong term.
We can put them on ban. We can put the irrigators on ban.
Well, you
so
set
you
limits.
only, yes. So it's only one area, not the municipal water or the industry supply is minimised.
So that's what we're trying to achieve through this plan.
Okay.
Oh, and in terms of identifying the effect that each of those sectors or each of those takes has on the streams and rivers, that's what this plot here is. It's showing the effect on each part of the aquifer, what effect the groundwater takes have on the Ngāruaru river flows. And so all those, you can see maybe some red dots in there, they're the municipal takes, and they have relatively large effect. But what's causing the biggest effect on the Ngāruaru River and the lowland streams is the cumulative effect of all those small takes. So all those yellow squares there are areas where the effect on streams and rivers is less than 2 litres a second. So when they get assessed individually, it's like, well, big deal, that's de minimis or whatever we want to call it. But cumulatively, what the model's showing is that they're having a large effect on the rivers and streams. And so that's the problem we have to deal with. And yeah, if that answers your question about balance.
Yeah.
Maybe?
I'm trying to learn your lingo. That's all good.
Okay.
I'm trying to figure out how to word it.
All right. And I'll try to mind my language.
You've got you've done work on what period of time that is too, because the way you're saying it, it sounds like it's over the whole 12 months, but it's not. It's over about 3 months, isn't it? At the most.
That is when the rivers and streams are at their lowest, so that's when the effects are felt most acutely. Yeah, I think I get to that later on in the talk, actually. So the way we identified how stream depletion occurs is our crack genius modeller, Pavel, ran the groundwater model with all the pumping going, and then he produced a time series, which is the red line here. And then in the model, he turned all the pumps off. And so that's the beauty of a model, is you can do that sort of thing. You couldn't do it in reality, or you'd annoy a heck of a lot of people. So he turned all the pumps off in the model and then ran it again with the stream depletion effect. And so the difference here, say for the Kariwarua, that red line is the stream depletion occurring with pumping, and that's without it. And so you calculate the difference there, and that is the effect of the pumping, because they're all, so for the Raupari, for instance, with a minimum flow of 300 that's shown there, you can see generally without pumping in summertime, it's a fairly flat sort of line, but you can see the effect of the increased pumping here, where the amplitude, the seasonal variation, the gap between the winter and the summer stream depletion is getting bigger and bigger as you go along. And so we're at the stage now where it's getting down to that minimum flow at times. And that's sort of one of the reasons why we've decided that what's allocated now, what's being used now, is enough. We don't want to get any worse than that, and so there's no more water being allocated. So that minimum flow of 300 litres a second that applies to the Raupari, being a lowland stream, low gradient, so it's not a steep stream, it's quite flat and doesn't flow very fast. So you need a lot of flow down there to keep the oxygen levels up sufficient to what fish will maintain their health. So that minimum flow has been established based on dissolved oxygen levels. And that's why we want to keep flow in that stream. This is the one, Rex, that talks about the effect during summer and winter. So what we've got here is pumping over 1 year from each of those sectors. I'm pretty sure this is 2012 to 13.
Sorry, what slide are you looking at?
With all the green on the bottom and the red on the top.
Not one that she's got, because it's...
Water pumping type graphs.
10 of 32.
Are they pink, yellow and green?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so there should be 4 plots at the top with solid and then bars going on in the bottom.
Thanks.
Brilliant. So what this is showing in the bottom plot, it's showing the pumping that went on for that year, the actual pumping. So you've got the municipal supply taking all year round pretty much the same for industrial, maybe a little bit more in summer. And then the irrigation takes really crank up in summer, which is what you'd expect, right? But by May, they've all pretty much stopped. And the really interesting thing about this graph is that you can see in May, this is the stream depletion that's caused in the Raupari, Mangateritiri, Kariwarua and the Iron Gate. You can see that even though there's no pumping going on, the effects continue on for 2 months or longer. And that also explains why putting people on pumping bans wouldn't work for managing the stream depleting effects of the groundwater takes, because if it takes 2 months and you still haven't recovered from that groundwater pumping, that's really of no benefit to a stream that's running low.
All he's telling there is to turn the water off 2 months earlier.
Yeah, if you know when they need to, if you've got a crystal ball.
That's what he's saying, though.
Predict the drought.
Predict the drought. So we're getting low, bang. We've got two months lead time, shove it up now.
So given we have a El Nino forecast for this summer, you'd say stop taking water now.
Sure. But the point I'm making to you, you said you couldn't stop this happening because there's a 2 month lead time for it. All I'm saying is just turn the thing around and say before you get to a point, you need to therefore have 2 months lead time and turn it off 2 months earlier.
Okay, technically that is correct.
Yes, so that's right. So it is more than technically, it's correct.
So what I should have said is it's really not practical to turn people off 2 months early. I can't imagine that flying.
That might be the answer, but it wasn't the answer you gave before.
Yeah, true, okay. Again, I'll mind my language.
No, just be precise.
Yeah.
So therefore, it's not practical.
Yep.
So what is the mitigation for the depletion?
That's the whole where we're heading, yeah.
Yep.
So another consideration that the tank group played around with was, well, what happens if we reduce the allocation rather than turning people off? What happens if we reduce the amount that's actually taken? And so this table models the effect on stream flow. Or first of all, let's look at the right-hand side. This is what happens if we increase the abstraction. And, you can see that the negative numbers means that you're getting more stream depletion going on. And that's why we don't want any more water taken. These numbers over this side, see this is 0, that's what we're, based on what we're taking now. If we reduce the allocation by 10%, these are the stream flow gains we'd get. The 20%, 30, all the way out to 100% for the Ngātaroto and these lowland streams. And it might look really attractive in terms of the numbers that you see there, because they're based on litres per second gain you would expect in those streams and rivers if groundwater use was reduced. But when we look at the effect of the groundwater pumping on the streams, it tells us that it's not really practical either, because if you look at the Karamu, for instance, a really high valued waterway, during the summer of 2012-13, there was up to 250 litres a second flow loss caused by groundwater pumping. And then if you look at the reduction in use that you would have to mitigate that, you wouldn't even get it with 50% reduction. You'd need like 100% everyone to stop pumping for there to be no effect. Some of the streams it doesn't work the same, but for the Karamu it's like that, and among a Tiri, where there's 40 litres a second during February of 2013 caused by pumping, you'd have to have around 50% reduction in pumping going on, and that's across the whole irrigation season, not just for irrigators but for municipal supplies and industry as well. And as you can imagine, the economic consequences of that would not be ideal. The Ngātaroto is a completely different story again, where you have like up to 800 or 900 litres a second being depleted from the Ngātaroto as a consequence of groundwater pumping during summer. And as you can see here, to offset that, you'd have to reduce the allocation by between 50 and 100% throughout the whole in Heretonga Plains for all takes. So that didn't really appear to be a solution in terms of addressing the entire problem. So then the model was used to look at other mitigation options.
Before you move past that, though, it seems to me that that last slide is an extremely critical slide to the broader philosophical question here. Because I get a sense that there are some folks who think, well, wait a minute, it's pretty simple. If we're right at razor's edge, where we're using more than we should be, why don't we just peel everybody back? Before we worry about anything else, kind of an obvious thing to do, let's just take some of this water back, ratchet these allocations down, claw it back, and so forth. What this is saying is how devastating that would be in terms of what is the gain from it against the economic cost of doing it. And if people don't, if people don't calibrate against that, then we have a kind of fundamental divide here. You either have to believe this and move on to some other options, or we have to have a pretty knockdown drag out here as to, what are we trying to do and who are we going to do it to?
That's right.
That's why I was looking forward to the mitigation plan.
So if we want to take a rollback off the table, then we can proceed.
Well, I am happy to leave that slide up and discuss further.
But what's the answer?
Okay.
Oh, that's what he was being.
All right, Plan B.
Yeah, as I said then, we thought, well, we've got a really powerful groundwater model here. Let's use it to explore some other options
Using it, so it's only
to offset the effects of those abstractions for public water supply, industrial use and irrigation. So what we looked at was stream augmentation, pumping of groundwater into streams during periods of low flow, and managed aquifer recharge, which we talked about just before, and the modelling said that's not really going to be an answer for Herotonga Plains. And there's also river augmentation, where you can take water, store it, take water during high flows, store it and release it for environmental purposes during low flows. And there is a consent for augmenting the Paritua, for instance, from Ngararoa river water at the moment. So we looked at those, and as I said before, the managed aquifer recharge was considered, but then there wasn't much appetite for pursuing that based on the modelling. And so stream augmentation from groundwater was looked at. And that's, yeah, as I said, it's pumping water from the aquifer to lowland streams during periods of low flow to enhance the flows by offsetting the effects of groundwater abstractions.
Question, Jeff.
Oh, sorry, yes.
So how many days per annum, on average, would you predict augmentation would need to occur?
Good question, Tanya, and I've got a table at the end.
Okay.
That talks about that. Yep. So the modelling results were really interesting, and I did mention this last weekend when I think Councillor Bailey, you might have asked me about, aren't we just robbing Peter to pay Paul? What these results show is that for the likes of the Iron Gate, this black line is the flow that's happening with all the abstractions going on, and the pink line up the top there is how much would have to be augmented to keep it at the minimum flow, which has got sufficient oxygen or velocity to keep the ecosystem going. And so what happens when we pump the groundwater in there, there is a small loss that happens from that pumping effect itself. So you'd have to top a little bit more to get to that level there. But it shows that the likes of the Iron Gate, the Karamu, it's really technically feasible. But for Karewarewa, you can see down here, this blue line shows that while you're pumping water into the stream's losing it just as fast, and you're just fighting yourself. So it's really not going to work in the likes of the Karewarewa, where there's a really highly conductive stream bed. And I think I mentioned last week at the meeting that's why we had a meeting with the Treaty Partners Group to discuss options for the Karewarewa and Paritua that have made it into the draft plan as Policy 55. But going back to the ones where stream flow enhancement was shown to work, Tanya, I think these are the days that you're wanting. Have you got?
You're on a map.
I've got that, yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. So this table, it's actually really rich, this table, with information on the feasibility of the augmentation option. So on the left-hand column is the streams, the lowland streams that we considered, and then we have the maximum number of augmentation days. So you can see that in a really, really dry summer, you need between 90 and maybe even 200 days augmentation. Now those ones that require a long period of augmentation are the Mangatere and the Karewarewa, where we sort of decided it's probably not going to work for those ones as well as some of the other streams. Yep.
Is this based on the current land use, not actually, the status quo of what the land is used on, as opposed to looking at different ways the land could be used?
That's correct.
Diminishing.
Yeah.
Well, it's actually current water use, isn't it?
It is, Peter, yeah.
There's no modelling done on what future prospective land use could be, given that's being discussed at a government level anyway?
No, it hasn't. It's based on, because I guess we're considering that no matter what land use there is, we're working on an actual use of 90 million cubic metres during a dry summer, no matter what that is used for.
No matter what.
Yeah.
And also on Herotonga, you wouldn't think the government's talking about land use change on Herotonga.
Chairman, you can't, realistic, maybe you can, but you can't pick winners and losers.
Yeah,
Can you?
not in council, no. No.
So,
The
Karamu,
model is based on what Karamu doing.
Yeah.
how much water do we have to put into the Karamu to keep it up, to augment it from water storage? I can't quite read that. What's the volume?
So the last two columns show that on a really, really dry year, including the Kariwiriwa and the Mangateritiri, you'd need 5 million cubic metres to get it through a really dry year. The Kariwiriwa might have its own solution along with Mangateritiri, so therefore you can take out 2 of that. So between 3 and 5 on a dry year, million cubic metres. In an average year, it's about 2 million cubic metres.
So that's just for the...
That's easy.
That's easy for...
I would have thought that would
simple for the whole lot of them.
Yep. Yep.
Everyone shares. Sorry? Everyone shares.
Yeah, Peter.
Jeff, of those, 3 of them are springs. 3 of those rivers are fed by springs, and we're talking big springs.
Yep.
Which are really just from the aquifer, it comes on up and almost to surface.
Yep.
So they're springs, they're not rivers. Some of them are, they're not streams. The Iron-Gate and especially the Raupare, go and have a good look at it. There's no stream, there's no river. It is just the flow out of those springs.
Big springs.
Yes.
And they flow higher than the ground.
Yep.
Some of them on the Karamu, for instance, are flowing above water level, river level. So they're coming up under pressure.
Yeah.
Under pressure.
Yep. And as the pumping increases and that pressure drops, the spring discharge drops.
Yes, because the flow isn't coming through the main river. It's in one end, out the other. It's just like a tube that you... Oh, sorry, guys. I've been about 50 years plumbing, and this is exactly what it's all about, and it's annoying having to sit through a lot of this when the science is wrong. We need to go to the Raupare and have a good look, take them out there and show them.
Tom,
definitely comes from big springs, Peter. No doubt about that.
Yeah, we don't doubt that
the springs are down 10, 15 feet is this layer of shingle that's bringing that spring through. It's not in the main confined 2nd or 3rd or 4th tier of the aquifer. I see there's only one picture in the book of an aquifer, but Peter Bevan's brought one here, Pete, where there was 3, 4, 5 levels of aquifer.
Yeah, that's as you get further down.
300 and 400 feet.
Yeah.
So we're talking about the little one at the top, which would have normally just flowed as waste.
I think the 5 layers are further down the Heretaunga Plains, more towards the coast, and where the springs are occurring, it's where it's the interface between the confined and the unconfined area, and you get spring popping through that confining layer, definitely under pressure. I don't disagree that these are spring-fed streams. I think for the Raupare, there are some reaches, I understand it, and Dr. Walding down the back might be able to help, but I understand there are some spring-fed tributaries, and there are some where there's diffuse flow through the stream bed itself. But
yes, man-made. We've been there when we went to look at the big pipe. Man-made, where the drains have been changed to shift this way. The flow has been moved in the other direction. You can see where the digging is, and you can see the shingle strata that's been hit. All done in 1920, 25.
I think Peter's right about the source of the water for a lot of those streams in that area you're talking about around the unconfined, semi-confined aquifer.
Yeah.
But I think the point you're making is that because of groundwater pumping, the amount of water that's being released by those springs into the streams reduces, and that reduction is what we need to find some way to compensate for. Is that correct?
Correct, yeah.
And you agree with that, Peter?
No.
You don't agree with that?
No, because what you just said, yes, we can see that is happening. It's only about so far underneath the soil. Oh. It is literally the river that was there in the past that's been covered in a flood, sealed, and it's broken out and it's a spring. So to say it's a stream and the streams are affecting it, and we need to keep that drain open, the drain because we want to farm the land, we now have to worry about fish. We now have to worry about something else. When it was really now just get rid of the flood problem.
So are you saying it's a consequence, the loss of flow is a consequence of drainage as opposed to groundwater pumping?
As the Ngaruroro, which feeds all of this, drops in the summer and drops, then there's very little to come through, get in the shingle, let Twyford and pop up. There's none. The maps will show it. The ancient maps have got it on it, where the shingle moved and where the drains were moved. So doing this on a desk performance, it's not the greatest to listen to.
So, Peter, can I just understand
Doesn't make sense.
the point that you're making? Are you saying that because these are springs that rise and fall in relation to the flow rate in the Ngaruroro, which dries up during the summer, we shouldn't be worried about them going to a lower flow during the summer because it's going to happen?
That's exactly it, and they shouldn't even be in the equation.
Oh.
We really need to get out as a team and have a real good look and a serious talk.
So you don't think that the pumping affects those rising falling springs? You think the river does?
Definitely the river does. And where you are on the fall, where the recharge comes in is 75 feet above sea level. That's about, what, 32, 33 metres high? And that is what's giving the pressure on the whole system. It's just another plumbing problem where we're running low pressure housing without a pump.
Oh, are you?
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, Kapai, thank you. Look, I'm not sure I've understood the points that are being made, but I did want to raise a point about the risk of augmentation on springs and the depletion of springs. It's a bit hard to explain, but my understanding is that where a recharge may be happening through augmentation, that might affect one part of the stream, but further upstream where the spring is the source, that those springs may recede over time because the augmentation is not affecting them.
Yeah.
And also the measuring of how effective the augmentation is would be between where the augmentation is happening and it's being pumped in versus where it's being measured, which would be downstream.
Yeah.
And the concern I've heard from tangata whenua groups is the depletion or receding of springs over time as a result of augmentation. And so, Jeff, I'd welcome your comments on what research has been done to look at that, because the value of springs to everyone, but in particular to tangata whenua groups, is important. So are you able to answer that?
Yeah, I'll probably park it, if you don't mind, Tanya, until I talk about the implementation.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a good time.
But do you agree that there is the risk, or that it will happen, that springs may recede, streams may recede, or springs may be depleted as a result of augmentation further downstream, that there will be an effect?
Yep, it's the magnitude of effect, I think, is the key here, and the timing of it. So the size of the effect, like if you're putting, say, 100 litres a second from groundwater into a stream, I don't think there would be, in the streams that we're proposing to augment, I don't think there would be anywhere near 100 litres a second depleted from the springs up gradient. And it would take some time for that effect to be felt as well, observed.
Is that what's shown in the modelling?
Yeah.
So we've got some slides on this, and we'll come back to it. Just, I think, Chair, I think we do need to address Peter's concern, because if he has fundamentally no confidence in the groundwater model, that goes to unpicking this whole package. So can you explain why it is that you believe, or the science team believe, that groundwater pumping is having a depletion effect on those spring-fed streams in the unconfined aquifer?
Just before you give that answer, it's the main one that you can go and have a good look at is the Mangatere.
Yep.
Spring-fed. How high above the Karamu, the level of the Karamu? What height above that is the Mangatere when it flows in? You can see it flow under the road and drop. So we have a spring higher than the river down below us. There's a difference there. That should even get the old brain working, that it's not quite right what we're looking at.
So, Peter, I'm just trying to understand your problem here. And what I heard you say before was that the Narororo River can get really low in summer, sometimes maybe dry, and therefore that's the problem we have, that there's no recharge going into the aquifer, rather than the groundwater pumping that's happening.
That's creating this. Well, your other delay is it could take several weeks before you see, if you shut off the pumps, that you see the result. Well, if there's no rain up in the hills, there's no water coming down the main river.
That's right.
And that on its own puts down.
Yeah, so
I could take you to 3 of those rivers and actually show you and prove it to you all.
What we've found, Peter, with the Narororo is that there is that reach where it loses water, about 4 cubic metres a second, which is a lot of water lost. And even when it's flowing really low, there might only be 1,000 litres flowing in there at Fern Hill. Upstream, you'll have 5 or around about that much. So that 4 cubic metres a second is still being lost. It's just you're not seeing flow in the river itself, but the groundwater recharge is still occurring at those times. So we still do have the recharge going into there. And if the springs and the stream flows are being lost, the modelling just won't work unless we have the groundwater pumping turned on. That's the only way we can get those streams and springs in the model to respond as they do in practice.
Can I
Yep.
help with some whiteboarding, perhaps? I think that would be a great idea.
This is Dr. Thomas Wilding, who's the eco-hydrologist at HBRC.
Yes.
Can I see that? Can someone put the screen to the whiteboard, please?
Yeah, so in terms of the, I'm not a groundwater scientist, but I've worked a lot on the springs across the Hiratonga Plains, trying to map those. So I'll just use this. Can people see the space down the bottom?
Yeah.
Can you see Tony?
So if we look at in the cross section, we've got Hiratonga Plains across here.
Thomas, could you maybe just turn it around a little bit this way? Just a little bit there. Thanks.
How's that?
Well, what about the people
Yeah,
in the back?
yeah, no,
I
not
can
so
see
much.
it. If you got your head out of the way, I reckon it'd be much easier. Oh, well, why don't you just leave the room?
So
Oh,
I think
you hurt your feelings.
a key missing element here is
Alan, you get out of the road too.
is the confinement. So you've got these confinement layers underneath the plains, which are kind of like open fingers from all estuaries, right, down here. So if you deplete this one, you're also depleting this one.
Sure.
There's lags and things going on, but they're connected.
Yeah.
Right. So if this part of the river is leaking, Narororo, 4,000 or 5,000 litres a second coming out of there, ongoing. So if you've got a spring that's coming up through this confining layer, it's under pressure, all right? And these are the ones you see that are boiling sand, big head on them, and a lot of water coming out. But that's not the only type of spring. You've also got some seeps up here, right?
Yep.
Where the water's just gradually trickling in and increasing. So those aren't under a lot of pressure. 2 ways that they're not under pressure. One is they're right at the edge of the groundwater table. Right, that's where the groundwater table's just hitting the surface. It's passively soaking out without a great deal of pressure. Slow trickle, and these are the ones we see at the top of the raupari where it's goes from mud, dry to mud, to eventually you see a trickle and a flow. There may be this third situation where you've got the river carries on, if you can kind of, that's looking side on, but imagine the river's sort of flowing around here. There may be some where there's this shallow layer of gravel that's an old, these are all old rivers, right? But there could be another old river here that runs across to these shallow springs. And that's the one where I think, like you're saying, you could have that spring there is dependent on what's coming across from the river right beside it. But in terms of the raupari, we've probably got all three of these, but the big ones are coming from these pressurised systems where there's a confining layer, and because you have a confining layer that doesn't go all the way to the river, okay, you've got this unconfined area. So it's not pressured until it gets in under this groundwater table, all right? And at that point, so it's not so it doesn't behave like a pipe connecting straight to the spring. We have this low pressure area in between where the water loss carries on and doesn't disconnect it, but it reduces that connection.
And the point is?
Point is, if you pump a whole lot of water out of here, you have to reduce that spring.
That's quite right.
There may be some springs where, okay, if they're running over the top of the confining layers, then maybe they're behaving independently.
But the only reason you'll get water bubbling to the surface here like this is because if there's effectively a column of water which goes all the way up to at least the height of that.
Yep, that's
It needs to be at least that height, so it's a confining layer, so it's under pressure. That's the only way it will bubble up.
Yep. Okay.
Where's the source
So
of the...
back to the raupari.
Yep.
At the top end of the raupari,
Where's
by
that?
the stop bank.
Yep. Up Nickel Road there.
Is that
The
Nickel
stop
Road?
bank was built on top of an old riverbed.
Yes.
There was a huge piece of bend in the river that's been built over, and that shingle's not very far under. And there's a massive amount of water, almost the whole of the raupari comes roaring out of there, except of course for the road bore.
Well, I would expect that some of those ones up around Twyford Road could be connected that way. But I'm not sure about these ones down, the height difference between the river and the big springs along the Raupari Road is pretty small, you know, to the river beside it. So it needs to be a pressure system to push all of that water, you know, 10, 20, 30 litres a second.
And that big one that you're talking about, the main flow is back up at the top at where the old river was, where the stop bank's been built over. The leaking from underneath. Bit of a rain, the river fills, it's come on up, you can see the flow moving.
The bigger ones lower down, the other possibility is the river's cutting down. As the river's reworked and cut into these clays, that it's made a thin patch of...
And did break.
No, I'm referring to up near Nicholson Road, right up by the Ngaru Road, or very, very close.
Yes.
Within a few...
Up by Twyford.
Yes.
So it comes up the other side of the stop bank.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's pouring through there, and that's the bulk of the raupari.
It's about possibly 20%. Could be a third, yeah.
I was looking about more than a half myself. Now, that's only one of the rivers. The Mangateretes is the same. The Iron Gate is the same. The Iron Gate was taking over half of that so-called recharge water flowing through there. It wasn't going anywhere. The last committee that put the operative plan together made a visit to that site, and that is when it got shut down. But yes, we must get on with the show rather than talk to something else.
So what have we resolved here
Nothing. There are just a lot of things in there that I totally disagree with, and I would say we're happier may even put in submissions.
Yep.
In the hearings. We're not happy with the desktop calculations. A bit more should be done on site. We were supposed to have site visits where we could have looked at it and talked about it, but we haven't. So I can almost guarantee you can get some submissions coming in.
The only other point I'd make is the flow out of some of those, the old road bores seems to have declined over time. So when they first went, there was huge amounts of water coming out, 50, 60 litres a second. They've dropped down to about 3 or 4 litres a second the last time we were out there. So they seem to be kind of closing up a little bit. So the contribution from those is...
Go out today and see what happens.
So you asked what was the point of it. The point is we want to take water off productive. Someone's paying tax because they've got a business going, and we need tax monies paid to keep this country going. Definitely. So with that in mind, yeah. No, I'll leave it at that.
So, Peter, can I ask, so what we're not doing is taking water off people, we're taking their allocations down to their actual and reasonable use. Are you concerned that we are not allowing more takes? Is that...
No, what you're going to do is keep a fishery, a so-called fishery open, that is literally only a drain taking away a spring that needs to be taken away. It's not like as if it was a stream, a river, a fishery, something bringing us kind, something that we did own in the past and lived upon. Springs do have a blessing, but we know where to go and get kai, but not to this extent that's going on.
Seems reasonably inconsistent with the values that we've been told exist for tangata whenua across all of those streams that you just mentioned, which included Mahinga Kai, included Te Mana o Te Wai.
This area that you're talking about is our land. As a kid, we all brought up over these, Grandad, all the way back. Our whole whakapapa is there, our family.
So are you saying we're overly concerned about the minimum flow, about maintaining the flows? I'm totally lost.
Some of the things that's been spoken of and what you want to do, I wonder why, when you're hurting production. I'm only
The proposal is
interrupting
not to hurt current production. The proposal is to find a way to ensure that we get better flows, better ecological outcomes while maintaining the current productive base.
If we'd done the field trip, we probably might have understood better.
So we're certainly keen to still do the field trips. It's just a case of factoring it into people's diaries. We did cancel on the basis that there was so much of this to do in terms of explaining the plan, explaining the policies.
I'd be keen to do it with Peter because the Rapari, understanding that source, understanding those big springs that are old Bruce Prudy's old property, huge springs there, they must drift into it too. Yeah. I'd like to get and Manga Territory, I don't understand that as well, or the Iron Gate, and I think a field trip, just walking around and say it comes from here, because, protecting the source is actually, I'd be really interested in doing, And I love that last presentation because it, sort of explained it really nicely how, the springs are all different. Like those springs in Rapari are big.
All three of them are there.
So if we can just go, Peter, I can't remember if you were present when we had a discussion at Tank about this, but I was of the view that you're expressing here as well, that the Rapari is not a stream, it's a drain. And a lot of it's a man-made drain. And that's right. And what you're saying is that this is effectively a drain that was made to capture water from a spring so it didn't go flooding farmland, basically.
Land, yes.
And I raised that question at a Tank meeting, and I said, why has the Rapari drain become
a stream that suddenly has to have ecological values and minimum flows and all the rest of it when it's just a drain. It's always been just a drain to everybody that lived there. And the answer came from Jenny Major, who said,
She took a walker up there.
my mother or my grandmother used to take a walker up that, or a boat up that stream, and it does have value. So you're saying one thing, she says the opposite. So I don't know where that leaves us.
Well, can I just question then? Perhaps Marianne can answer. What do the Tangata Whenua values report say about the raupari?
I can't, off the top of my head, think of specific values that were identified for the raupari.
But the other question...
General.
But the other question is that Peter Bevan asked, I think, from my recollection, about half a dozen times, was how did the Regional Council come to change the Raupari drain to the Raupari stream, and why did it do it? And I've never heard an answer to that either.
Peter, can I ask Peter that? Is it a possibility that from the Nararora, where the Raupari enters the Nararora, that part of it was a stream because there are springs all the way down, and that where Kevin Bailey's is up from there, it's a drain. So part of it was a stream once. Is that a possibility?
No.
Not.
Right at the headboard where the straight part of the raupari comes, up to near the stop bank, there was a huge cutting in there. It's on the maps. I should have brought a map.
That was all dug.
Where you can see where the Ngariroro was huge, shingle, right there, and they built the stop bank on top of it. And the water just goes straight underneath and pours out. You could see it really move.
Well, then Rick's question is valid.
Do you want to say something, Thomas? Well, just one point. Before the Nararoro moved from flowing down the what's now the Iron Gates, it moved and started flowing around on the other side of Twyford there. Yeah. From the old maps, it was the Waitio and the Ohiwea flowed down what is now the Raupari.
Yep.
So there would have been a stream there before the river moved. And afterwards, with the springs there, there was a wetlands complex there.
It was really still
and
wet.
my understanding is that in terms of a Resource Management Act's case law, if you drain a wetland and create a permanent stream, that stream is a stream rather than
a drain.
And a drain. Oh, that's a good answer. Are we satisfied with that?
No, I won't even accept that. Those rivers had been changed at the same time, would say within 50 years, changed and moved. The Ngariroro was moved twice and was moved by Kraitiana Takamoana, second MP for the Eastern Board for Maori.
Those Tamonas, eh? God.
That is why we take the photo into Parliament each time.
And I'd also wonder how much those springs increased when the river moved. The loss moving closer to that stream.
And that is where they were started, by the changing of that river, bringing it that way. It doesn't resolve anything that's happening here yet, though.
Well,
but we can still get on with the rest of it.
Yep.
So do we take the raupari out of consideration?
No, because I think the explanation, we don't, because it's still an important waterway now. And, it doesn't matter whether we're redefining it. I think we're over that. We've had that argument 2 years ago, Pete, didn't we?
Look, to be fair, I mean, I still regard it as a drain, but it's also correct to say I many times saw people parked on the side of the road going into the raupari to collect kai.
Yeah.
Watercress.
Yeah.
Watercress.
That's absolutely true.
Because it's the cleanest water in Hiratonga.
Very, very clean
Beautiful.
water.
So it's a cultural value.
It's got to be of some value, yeah.
It's a cultural value.
And whether it was a drain, it's become a stream, the fact is people regard it today as a stream.
They do.
So to go back and say the raupari is no longer a stream, it's a drain, well, it'll be just outrage.
No, not out there, not in the region out there. No, they all call it a drain still.
The point that was made of it is where you're talking of rivers and streams and you're bringing those conditions onto a super drain It's that, why are you putting it on a drain? When it should be a special case on its own, out of the road, and not influencing anything else up there.
I'll take it out this
But anyway, let's get back to work.
All right.
Too much time.
All right, next, Jeff.
Okay.
Did you get all that, Jeff?
I want to see that recorded.
Fortunately, it's recorded.
All I can say is I'm really happy to come on a field trip too, Peter. I've really enjoyed
I
it.
think that'd be great.
Yeah.
It'd be a great day out.
Yeah, and let's
We
continue
need
the
to.
corridor there.
Because
I agree with that.
Yeah, we can't do
Rick bring
everything
his
up
rifle?
top
He
on a
wants to-
computer.
Can Rick bring his rifle? He might want to shoot.
Oh, there's no ducks down there, but there might be the odd eel.
That's optimistic.
Just in terms of the science that went into the draft plan, this is the stuff that we looked at in this table here. So, Tanya, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, great. We've lost your video, but that's cool. So the median number of augmentation days is like 50% of years you'll need more than that number of days augmented, 50% it'll be less. So again, for the likes of the Karewarewa and the Mangateri, the number of days is quite high, but other ones it's like 2 months or so. For the Raupari, it's like 3.5 days. We talked about the maximum yearly requirement for augmentation, and if there's any questions about that table, I'm happy to answer them, otherwise we can move on.
I think we'll move on.
Great.
Sorry, can I just check? Do these figures take into account climate change? I know we've addressed this before, but I can't remember.
Yeah.
My understanding is we're expecting longer, drier summers in the future.
Yeah, no, they don't, Tanya. I did some climate change. Oh, there we go. I did some climate change analysis that looked at the predictions from 5 or 6 global climate models, and found that in this planning horizon, like 20 to 30 years, there's really no statistical difference in that sort of time frame with the climate change predictions to what the previous climate was in historic. It's as you get out to like 50 to 100 years' time that those climate change impacts are supposed to be observed. So for that reason we chose, and another factor is that there's so much uncertainty with those models as well. Some of them were a lot drier than the current climate, some of them were a lot wetter, so it's like, well, until there's certainty around these models, and given that this planning horizon of 10 years or 15 years won't be affected by climate change is you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
But the other thing too is that your graph here is working on the worst case we've had in recent times.
True.
So if we're working on the worst case in recent times, that should be a pretty good measuring stick for an average, run-of-the-mill time.
Yeah.
So, sorry, just one other thing, Jeff. Can you remind us how, in an average year, how many million cubic metres does that, if we augmented to those levels, how many million cubic metres it represents?
5, you said.
2 million in an average year.
2 million in
up to 5 in those really dry years. So yeah, that gives you an indication of climate change requirements, I guess.
Now, sorry, Jeff, you're talking about the table you've got, all the heading up there is low stream flow enhancement, and then you're talking about augmentation.
Yeah.
So enhancement is where you're taking the water out of the aquifer and putting it back into the stream or river.
Augmentation, I think, is part of the stream flow enhancement that the draft plan introduces. There's also riparian planting and other provisions in there. But yeah, that's what this is talking about.
So the augmentation is intended to come from a bore from out of the aquifer back into the river again. It's not intended to be the water to have to come from somewhere else, like from storage or something like that.
Not in this case, although it gives you an indication of how much would be required from an out-of-stream storage. If you wanted to do it that way, it would be the same volume that's required, but you wouldn't have any of those groundwater pumping effects added to it. I guess one of the advantages with the two things that we use storage for is because water's in the wrong place at the wrong time, and so we can use storage to augment streams, I guess, at the right time. So you're taking it when there's high flows and using it when there's low flows. But getting it there to the right place is an issue unless you've got a network of races or a system to get it across to those lowland streams like the Karamu. So one of the advantages of augmenting from groundwater is you're taking it from relatively close to the stream, far enough away so you're not directly affecting the flows, but close enough so that you don't need miles and miles of races to get the water there.
You've showed on the graph there that we are, because we pump, we then have losses.
Yeah.
But if we had a dam, just for say dam and stored water, what would be the volumes that we'd require on average and extreme to maintain that without the pumping?
Yeah, it'd be about the same.
Well, what's the point of the blue line then?
Or the drain, as I
That blue line there is showing like the effect of the pumping for augmentation on itself. So if you had out of...
I got that.
Yeah, if you had out of stream storage, you wouldn't have that extra requirement.
Okay. Does the cultural assessment cover
below 200.
cover if you taking water from one source and transferring it to another source and where that sits?
I think the mixing of water issue may not apply here because it's water that would have flowed. That is the source of water to these lowland streams anyway, so you're just speeding up the process of it getting into the streams.
Was that a question that was covered in the cultural assessment?
Not so much in the assessment, but certainly in conversations around the tank table.
Right.
And also important to note that this is a policy that proposes going and investigating further. This is not a this is ready to go, just give us the thumbs up. This is a commitment to go and do further investigations, which would involve obviously not only figuring out what the science of it is, but what are the social and cultural impacts.
The challenge I have with that is that we're allowing certain takes to be maintained in a catchment based on the predication that we're going to go out and investigate something which, if it turns out isn't acceptable for one reason or another,
then we have to revisit the allocations. We have to revisit that again. Yeah.
Yeah, this is entirely a technical feasibility exercise, really, and as Tom says, the plan enables this to happen, but subject to certain investigations.
These would have to be consented and would have to go through that whole.
Just come back to this question again about the graphs here. We had a figure of 2 and we had a figure of 5. And what we said was this is the amount of pump. If you put that amount in, then because of lossages in the stream, I think it's connectivity or conductivity is the word you use, we'd then be down to the blue line and we'd then have to pump more to get ourselves to the top of the pink line. So is your 2 and 5 figure represented by the net effect at the blue line and then you have to pump more to get up to the top of the pink? Or is it that you've taken into account the 2 and 5 has taken into account the losses and we're back up to the top of the pink?
Yeah, top of the pink.
Okay, so if we had water which was stored in a reservoir type of thing, a dam, and therefore the water you're putting into the stream was not depleting the stream's area around it, so what would the figures then be? Still 2, you said still 2 and 5, but that doesn't make sense to me.
So you see here.
Can I just ask you this question at morning tea?
No, I can say if you look here, the maximum augmentation rate for the Karamu is 343.
Mm-hmm.
Oops.
340.
If we go back.
Oh, yes.
Drive a car. Doesn't stop you from driving a car.
To this one, you can see the maximum there, and that really dry year is 270. So that's the extra that you have to put in there. So that number there is what you'd have to put in from a out of stream storage.
Okay.
Sorry, can you?
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
So what? No.
Oh, so this number here. Oh, sorry.
I know the number you mean. Yep.
Yeah. So 250 litres a second is the depletion of the Karamu stream.
Yep. Yeah.
And then if you look at the chart I showed before, it's like over 300 has to be pumped to get it up to there because there is some loss from that. But
I get that.
Yeah.
I was just wondering whether you had to store 5 or something less than that to get the same figure.
Gotcha.
Good thing. Because we've got one scenario you've got losses, the other one you don't.
Yep. Yep, that is, yep, I'll get to that too.
Okay.
Oops, where am I?
So this doesn't change that.
Oh, there. Okay, cool.
None of this changes.
Okay, so now we get to the implementation part of it. I hope everyone understands that. If not, happy to talk afterwards or
Do you
whenever.
want to pause for a cup of tea now? You've got, or yeah, I think we will. Because you're going to a new process.
Give us the policy and then we can think about it.
Okay.
Okay.
Righto.
Yep, so the policy is the council will remedy or offset the groundwater abstraction effect if remedying is not practical, the stream depletion effects, by developing stream flow and habitat enhancement schemes. So that's part of the stream flow enhancement, and improving stream flows in lowland streams where the groundwater abstracting is depleting it, and the purpose of that is to improve the oxygen levels and reduce water temperatures. And here's the kicker, it commits us to consult on the design and management of the flow enhancement regime. So Tanya, this is where I'm getting to your question about protecting springs and the upstream reaches. We go out to consult on this. That's the sort of thing that'll be discussed. Now, you may have seen this map in the groundwater modelling report, and it's got augmentation locations in here. These circles here. Now, these are entirely hypothetical. Because we aren't in the business of designing a scheme, we're wanting to draft a plan and ascertain the environmental effects or any effects of augmentation. We had to put those bores somewhere, so we put them there, but they're entirely hypothetical for this technical feasibility assessment.
Can we all have a copy of that map? I think it'd be very interesting to everybody.
Yep, that is in the...
it's in there, is it?
It's in the groundwater scenario modelling report, which is on the tank website.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a whole...
Seriously, can we just have...
Oh.
That's really interesting because we can follow the rivers and...
Yeah, it shows the gaining and losing reaches there.
We just get that printed off with a copy for all of us.
What's the date of that report?
It's something like Heratonga Groundwater Scenario Modelling Report is the title of it, and it's published in August last month.
So did TAC look at that report?
They saw all the science that's contained in that report as it evolved. So we were like running with where the tank group sort of steered us, and then it was all packaged up at the end, and they got access to it at the same time it was published with to the general public.
What's the rule number we're talking?
But they saw all the science in there, that's for sure.
What's the rule number we're
So,
talking?
are we going to take a break? Because otherwise I had a couple of questions.
Oh, thank you.
What I was wanting to say, just before we take a break, and maybe we could take a question, is that the actual bore locations will be identified via consultation. So enhancing those upstream reaches, totally get it. They'll offer greater ecological and other benefits. So that's the sort of thing that would need to be established during the scheme design in that consultation phase. So please don't assume that that's where the augmentation would occur.
But you would have based the hypothetical bores on something. You wouldn't have just thrown a dart there and said, oh, they'll be over there, there and there. You must have based it on something, premised it on something.
Mostly every bore we added to the model complexity, so she wanted to keep it simple. And let's say it was for the iron gate, it was all coming out of one bore just to see the effects on the groundwater. Because it is so highly transmissive anyway, we're sort of saying, well, if you take it all out of one bore, if you have it from a bore field, it's probably going to be the same effect in terms of environmental effects of that take. Tanya, can I take questions?
Yeah.
Yep. Tanya?
Sure. So just wanting to understand why Forest and Bird and the Treaty Partners Group did not agree with Policy 35, which I guess the proper word for it would be augmentation.
There were actually quite a number of topics that were raised in relation to possible adverse effects of this stream flow enhancement, and we covered those in the meeting report for the 12th of September. But some of the concerns, I'm just trying to find it now. Okay, so the concern, just at a general level, the concerns that were raised that we looked in more detail to are what were the environmental benefits of lowland stream augmentations or flow enhancements. And we were able to point to some other work in relation to that, particularly in terms of the Twyford project and some of the findings that are coming out of places like Environment Canterbury. The flow enhancement scheme was considered by some to be a short-term solution, and they were looking at perhaps longer-term solutions. I guess the jury is still out as to whether it is a short or a long-term solution. There was concern that
What was their longer-term solution?
Well, we don't really have any other
Storage.
options.
Oh, with the Karamu storage, it's a clear one.
I thought so too.
Possibly.
What was Tangata Whenua and Forest and Birds?
Well, reduction in pumping was something they wanted to explore further, but we've already demonstrated the likely costs relating to that. And that augmentation doesn't treat the cause of the problem, which is a little bit circular because it's as a result of groundwater abstraction. There were concerns about the further allocation or the further, robbing Peter to pay Paul concept. There was a need to explore that in more detail, and Jeff's gone into that. The success of the Twyford scheme was through community involvement and leadership, and that was seen both as a risk as well as an opportunity, depending on how that's managed. So there were a number of topics that were explored in relation to this. So to say what was the key problem was a little bit difficult. There was a range of issues.
Can I just ask if the RPC determined that we were going to do augmentation, but the volume of water used had to be within the cap of 90 million, would that overcome some of the concerns that have been raised?
It certainly did make a big difference with the number of people around the tank table, that it wasn't an allocation limit plus augmentation, it was an allocation limit including the augmentation.
Sunny in Wellington.
Yeah, that's gorgeous.
Why are we sitting in a gloomy room here? Were you sitting in the sun?
Really could have invited us down, Tony.
Pull your blinds across.
We're sitting in
Can't be done.
in the windows.
What you're talking about, Marianne, that when you chucked the report from the 12th of September, is that page 59 on that? Cause
Yes, yeah, well that's...
55 onwards, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so... So that is from a fix.
The 90 is the key figure, isn't it?
So where does that...
Or storage.
Where in that paper does it discuss concerns raised by Tangata Whenua and Forest and Bird?
Well, they were the general concerns expressed by various parties. We haven't ascribed any of those particular concerns to a stakeholder.
Well, so you have in the policy, in the draft policy, you have rule number 35 or whatever it is, where you have a little note on the right-hand side which says this was not a consensus site because of concerns by Forest and Bird and Tangata Whenua.
Yep.
And it's not clear in the paper that you gave us exactly what I want to know what those concerns were and get a really good understanding of them. And it's not really clear to me from in here and the paper that you gave us on the 12th where it actually is.
They were all concerns expressed by those parties.
And you extract...
The whole paper, which paragraphs? The whole, because there's not a heading that says these are the concerns raised by these parties.
Paragraph 83, there's some commentary starts there on page 57.
It was more in relation to the issues and uncertainties that were identified as part of the stream flow enhancement. So it was a generic assessment of the issues and uncertainties that the tank members raised, and that starts at paragraph 69 in that document.
And goes through to...
goes through to page, or paragraph 96.
So what I would have hoped to have got out of today is a response to those particular concerns so that I could come to a conclusion, because I now have to make a decision because Tank was unable to reach a conclusion. So what I would have hoped to have got out today was I could go through this tonight and read through these concerns and go, yes, you've answered that because you've given us this presentation, tick, 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 tick. And I can go through and look at those Have you given us sufficient information for us to?
I think if you read those paragraphs, 69 through to 96, you will get an understanding of what the concern was and how the science and the knowledge addresses it.
Okay.
I do want to pick up on your points though, Councillor, because I think Ricky Allison, one of the independent advisors, sent through an email, might have been last night or early this morning, re-emphasising the need to, in addition to all the other values, but also to look at cultural values and understand what they are and how they've been picked up and dealt with in the plan. So I think otherwise what we're trying to do is sift through these many reports, but I think it should also be picked up in the Section 32 report. But ideally, and this is my first substantive plan change to be looking at, but my understanding is that ideally, although we've got matters that have not been finalised, particularly these, some of these still outstanding matters that we're still discussing, that a Section 32 report would have helped us to understand what our obligations are to take into account, and given us, even if it was a draft, given us something to, I guess, test the reports and the draft plan against. So I'm grateful for all the information that's been provided, but I have to confess, with information overload and trying to sift through what is happening out there, what are we trying to do, and whether the plan achieves that, and whether the plan, from a decision maker's perspective, caters for all the many values that we have to take into account, including tangata whenua. So I think the Section 32 report is really needed, even if it was in draft, to help guide us through this, to understand it. Because I find it very difficult at the moment.
I think your expectations of the Section 32 might be a little bit misplaced, in that the material in the supporting documentation and the paragraphs we just referred to try to explain what some of the issues that the various stakeholders had with this solution for stream flow mitigation. The fact that Mana Whenua and Forest and Bird don't agree with the solution shows that those values that you talked about are not being met because they couldn't agree with this as the solution. So we need to get some guidance from the RPC. What is the solution, so that we can then formulate the Section 32 report that looks at the costs and benefits of the solution that you've come up with. So we've identified some of the issues and concerns that the various parties have had. We haven't always particularly pinpointed exactly which concern, but certainly there were a range of concerns, and they are listed out in the paper from the 12th of September.
So you're needing something definitive from the RPC in order to formulate the Section 32 report.
Yeah.
It's a chicken and egg scenario.
Yep.
Again, though, it's not the end of the trail. There is a process that follows that.
Yep.
But at some point, we're going to have some directive to staff in order for the thing
that we
to
can
proceed.
move. So you've heard the science, and you've heard about the different mitigation measures that we've modelled and the impact they have in terms of the modelling that Jeff has just gone through. And you've heard about some of the concerns that the various parties have got. The solution that most of the tank members agree with is in Policy 35. There are some that don't agree with that. So the decision now is in front of this committee to say, well, how do you want us to proceed, knowing what you've just heard about in terms of the science and the impacts?
Well, I do think it's really important, not just a numbers game at tank, but for us as decision makers to understand those values and the pros and cons and what the solutions are. I'm a little bit worried about whether a lot of emphasis has therefore been given to augmentation, and that's what we're being presented with, without other options being explored to the same extent. I know you've given some reasons why other options have been discarded, but I'm still at a loss to be able to weigh them up because of trying to, explore, well, if you favour this value and then you don't favour these other values, these are the costs and benefits for each of them. Trying to weigh up those options. Because Tank may have come to a view on that, but we have to also check whether we agree with that view, and so need that information. So, for example, the idea of reducing the amount of water take or the pumping, the comments made is that economically that's not viable. I don't know, do we have sufficient information here to be weighing up the economic impacts versus the values of tangata whenua or ecological values, so that we can actually see through this decision and either agree with, the way it's going or have some concerns or different views?
So we didn't model the impact of a 50% reduction, for example, of the allocation across the plains. For groundwater.
But it wouldn't be 50%, because you wouldn't be able to take 50% of the community's water supply, and you probably wouldn't be able to take much of the industry supply. So in fact, what you're talking about probably is 100% of the irrigator supply. Well, that's just not, how could you consider that? It's just nuts.
Well, no, I don't know that. I'm not saying that. I'm just asking what are the options, Peter?
So that we did do some economic analysis that AgFirst and Market Economics and Nimo Bell did for us, and that was in relation to changes to security of supply, but they indicated the level of adverse effect in terms of economic impact as well as social and cultural impact if we substantially affected the pattern of water use in the Heritonga Plains. So that is an indicator of the level of adverse effect if you substantially change the allocation limit.
And did that include incremental change over time?
We did model the effect of changing minimum flows over time, but not changes to allocation limits in the plains.
And certainly to Jeff's earlier presentation, what it demonstrated is that incremental reductions in the abstracted water volume make a very small difference to flows in the stream. So in terms of achieving substantive outcomes relative to the values that you're talking about, Tanya, you don't get those through incrementalism. Hence the proposal to do augmentation, because it's the most cost-effective and practicable way to get a substantial in-stream benefit alongside those other measures which are in the plan, such as the riparian fencing and planting, which we will do anyway. So, I'll be reasonably frank, I don't think we heard from Forest and Bird or the, keep wanting to say the Mana Whenua group, the Treaty Partners Group,
They're the same.
A particularly developed set of arguments for an alternative policy response to this. Just a concern that this was just didn't kind of didn't feel right, didn't sit comfortably.
But on saying that, you can't articulate what their issues are with Policy 35. You say that they're combined and consolidated in all of the issues raised. So if you can't articulate what the challenges are for the Treaty Partners Group,
well,
how is it going to change my mind?
I do think those issues and concerns have been articulated in the documentation you received on the 12th of September.
And Jane, just coming back to something you said there, that you hadn't received a well-developed solution or alternative from tangata whenua groups or Forest and Bird. I'm not sure that that is their role, though. I think their role is to raise issues that they're concerned about, and it's the role of HVRC to investigate how they can be catered for in a way that accords with their values. To the same extent, you might investigate augmentation, for example.
Sure, so I think, look, you can't magic up water. It's very simple. You either allocate less or you come up with an augmentation regime, or you mitigate the worst effects of the current takes by shading, and we've proposed to do shading, and we've proposed to do the augmentation. And so augmentation is a policy which has been investigated and developed. The impacts of reducing take have been looked at. I'm not aware of any other solution to put into the mix.
I'd still like to know what their challenges are, though, wouldn't you?
It's in the report.
It's in the
report.
It won't be in the plan.
This one? No, it won't be in the plan.
No, it won't, because the
plans, because the plan's policy. We don't put dissenting views into a draft plan.
It's on the report that we got on the 12th of September, which was the meeting last week, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Last week,
Which,
yeah.
look, to be honest, I'm with you. I have to go back and reread that again and read it properly, because we have had information overload, and it's really hard to keep up with everything. So I'm not going to make a decision today as to where we go, because we're not here to make a
We're going to
decision.
make a decision today.
Can we just...
But it's quite...
It's a workshop.
Today's not a decision making, and decisions made were last week to give us some interim guidance on this so that we can lead to and build the Section 33 report to give you some additional guidance. Tanya, can I just in terms of the values,
No, because I'm
mapping the values,
I'm reading
can I have a quick
from the Tanga Whenua
You got time
on
to
their
quick
words.
response on that?
It's a version of the
We need to do that, have a cup of tea first, I think.
I think a cup of tea is a very good idea.
Yeah, yeah, see the union's on my back now.
It's just to start to segregate here. We've got subcommittees all over the place.
Yeah.
As I see it.
So we'll pause, go and grab a cup of tea and come back to the table within 10 minutes, eh?
Yeah.
So Tanya, you go and grab from your flash coffee machine.
Come back to the table in 15.
10.
Maybe a good
10.
Not compromising on 15. It's my final offer.